As we continue on our journey, I remind everyone of what we're using as our resource. And we will continue to use the book Lent is Not Rocket Science by Bishop Nicholas Knisely. When we began our journey, we were looking at things on the cosmic scale, or even bigger than cosmic, on the universal scale. This week, we're going to go down into the quantum scale, as small as we can get. What is the quantum scale? Well, those are things even smaller than the radius of a single atom. One of the questions we find in natural philosophy is there something that is too small to be divided? Democritus, who is an ancient Greek philosopher, thought there had to be. So he imagined something invisible that he called an atom, from the Greek word that literally means uncuttable. He imagined that such things must be eternal, since by their very indivisible nature they must be indestructible. It turns out that his ideas were just a little bit off. When scientists first recognized the existence of atoms, they thought they had discovered the entities that Democritus imagined. But atoms can be divided. It's the things that make up atoms that turn out to be atomic in the way the early philosophers imagined. Let's look at those. These ultra-small particles, the electrons, the quarks, and other fundamental elementary particles, were created in the fires of the Big Bang explosion that began the universe and exist, each one unchanged still today. Everything you are made of is a product of the first moments of the explosive expansion of the universe. And for reasons no one understands, all those fundamental particles are exactly the same. Each up or down quark has exactly the same mass and charge. Each electron is exactly like any other electron. There is no variation, no fuzziness. They are all identical quanta. And to make matters more complicated, they have an inherent duality that stretches our ability to comprehend past its limits. Each particle is also a wave, and each wave is also a particle. It's all very strange. God is something like all of this. There are moments when we experience God and we think we can understand. It would seem that God is like us, just larger and more powerful. Then something happens, a miracle, or a disaster, or prophecy that suddenly turns our understanding of God upside down and makes us realize that everything that has gone before in our experience of the divine is incomplete and, in some fundamental ways, misleading. Our first set of questions. What is fundamental about God for you? And what are the simplest things you can say about God? It's funny how we as a society have come to believe that science can answer any question in a definitive way. It doesn't matter what someone might claim. What matters, at least in today's culture, is what, quote, scientists say now, unquote. The idea that there is one correct answer and that science alone has the ability to determine what that answer is comes probably from the way we're taught science and the scientific method as students. Generally, we're shown how to solve problems using very specific tools and are expected to be as accurate as possible. But the truth is that every answer in scientific research has an associated uncertainty. Every numeric measurement has an associated error. A good experiment is designed to minimize these errors as much as possible, but there's a limit to what can be done. At best, we are limited by the precision and the accuracy of the instruments we are using to make our measurements. Because of that, There are a number of formal techniques to account for the various errors in measurement, ways to accumulate them, and graphically show them as you see on the screen when data is presented. In some fields, the error bars are actually shown on the graphs, which are small indicators of how high or how low, what kind of error range we expect for the numbers that are being graphed. And in some fields, those errors are always very, very tiny. But if you're talking about astronomy, the errors can be 200 or 300% of the measured quantity. Even if we could somehow magically minimize those sorts of extreme errors, there is inherent in reality itself a fundamental uncertainty at all levels. You may have heard of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. That principle is a consequence of the experimental observation that all particles have an associated wavelength and wave behavior. It means that it is impossible to ever know everything about even the simplest part of the universe. An electron is a very small, unusually simple, most well understood part of the universe, and yet, if you try to tell me exactly where it is, you forfeit the ability to tell me anything about its motion. The situation is worse for even slightly more complicated systems, and in terms of absolute knowledge, it is unimaginably difficult for something massive. Truth, scientifically speaking, isn't just the absolute we want it to be. The best we can do in our science is an approximation, a best estimate of the answer to a simple question. That is why we're constantly reevaluating the science. When physicists first started to see the variety of subatomic particles, they hoped to be able to put it into some sort of a pattern. And when they took all the energy levels and actually put it together, they created something of a ladder. These ladders of energy levels show that quantum materials can stay at each of those states that you see. Very interesting to us is from the dream that Jacob had that night he slept on the ground in a place he named Bethel, described in Genesis 28, verses 10 through 22. Jacob saw a ladder extending all the way up into heaven with angels ascending and descending on it. In other words, those angels are each on a specific rung at a certain point in time, and they move up and down that ladder, just like those particles on the other side of my head. Rank upon rank of angels up to God, and rank upon rank of angels from God back down to humanity. We wonder if we might look at the created order all around us today and see in it the very first rung or rungs of the ladder that leads up to God. Everything we see in our everyday life is a flight of things that above that there's at least one more, and one more above that, and God, who is light and energy, fills all the levels of creation and even beyond what we can perceive. The things of our existence can be stepping stones on our journey to God's full presence. Anyone who has been inspired by the physical fabric of a beautiful worship space or by the odd expanse of a vista in front of them knows exactly how this happens. Some questions for us. What are you seeing to simplify in your life? And is there something in your life that might be more complex than you wanted it to be? Can you accept that? As you look more carefully at things, you will see more and more and more details emerge. Perhaps you have spent time peering through a microscope and looked at things on the very, very small scale. Can you remember what it was like to stare through a microscope and see all of the little living things in a single drop of water from a puddle? But as you continue to go down in scale and look at smaller and smaller things, unexpected features give way to cellular life and cells give way to gigantic biological molecules, and then smaller ones, then atoms, and then, well, nothing. We get to the atomic level and we start to look at what exists inside the electron cloud of an atom, and we discover that the inside of the atom is pretty much completely without structure. It doesn't mean that there isn't a core or a nucleus, and within that nucleus, which is extremely tiny, like something of 100,000 times smaller than the electron cloud. So essentially and unexpectedly, atoms are empty space. Do you remember back when we started what we talked about with the universe? Most of it is empty space as well. In that emptiness, the void within all atomic matter that makes us stop and take notice. If we were on the atomic scale, the next nearest person to us would be as far away as the moon is from the center of the earth. And between two people, there would be, well, nothing. And the next thing beyond that person would be another moon away. Can you imagine living in such a sterile vacuum of existence? You might find yourself grateful for the crowded, noisy world that is our everyday experience. It causes us to wander, to strive, to look for connections. The confusion of the world leads us to wonder about the author of that confusion. And that leads us to wonder about God. What are you grateful for in the crowded, noisy world of your everyday experience? One of the surprising tenets of quantum physics is the idea that when we observe something, we change it. The idea itself is not terribly surprising. Anyone who has put a cold cooking spoon into a pot of boiling water knows that the moment you put that spoon into the water, you change the character of that water. The roiling boil is interrupted. Both the cold temperature of the spoon and the way the surface of the spoon interacts with the surface of the water, you're changing everything. If you were to put a big thermometer into water to try and measure its temperature, you could see that you have the same effect on the system, because the thermometer itself will affect the thing that you're trying to measure its temperature with. So if you have a huge thermometer into a small space, you're going to change the temperature of that small space. There is an interesting parallel here with the way we imagine how prayer works. When we pray, we imagine something is happening because we are praying. There are times in our prayer when we know that our prayer is changing us more than our prayer is changing the situation that we are raising up to God. There are times in our prayers when we are made more aware that God's presence is present in this situation because we are praying. There are times when we wonder if the very act of prayer might have an effect on the system in the same way that observing the system has an effect upon it. We don't understand it. We can explain it, but it does give us something to wonder about. Physicists will admit, if you ask them, that no one really knows what it physically means to make an observation on a small system. We can talk about the mathematics, we can connect the mathematics and the physical and what physically happens. That seems parallel to what happens when theologians talk about prayer. We know that Jesus tells us to pray. We know that prayer changes things, but we don't often understand how. Maybe if you're worrying about what happens when you pray, you might remember that even though we don't understand how something works, it still works. And our final questions. Have you ever felt the prayers of others in your life? What was that like? And what changed as a result? Holy Week is next.